Part 1. They laughed first. They laughed at Samuel Crowell because he didn't cut firewood. They laughed because his chimney never smoked. And when the first killing cold slid down from the north in the autumn of 1893, they laughed long enough to place a bet. They said he wouldn't live to see spring. Out here in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming Territory, laughter like that wasn't meant to be cruel. It was practical. Men only spoke so plainly when they believed winter was about to settle an argument with a body. Samuel heard the laughter, but he didn't answer it. He was standing knee-deep in Clear Fork Creek, the water already biting hard enough to numb his legs, fitting stones and oak paddles into a wheel that turned without any purpose most men could recognize. All through August, the valley rang with axes. You could hear steel biting timber from sunrise until the shadows stretched long across the basin floor. Every blow carried the same unspoken fear. Winter always came faster than men expected, and it always punished those who underestimated it. Firewood was safety. Firewood was sleep. Firewood was the difference between waking up stiff and waking up dead. That was the rule everyone lived by. So when the settlers noticed Samuel Crowell wasn't following it, the laughter came easy. While other men hauled logs with aching shoulders and blistered hands, Samuel worked the creek. He raised a narrow wooden flume along the bank. He positioned the wheel where the drop was just enough to keep it turning day and night. No millstones, no saw rig, no belts or gears leading anywhere useful. Just a wheel that turned slowly, patiently, as if it had no concern for the coming winter at all. Men stopped on horseback to watch. Some made jokes about Dutch tricks and lazy inventions. Others said nothing and rode on, already counting how many weeks a man could last without a proper woodpile. Silence, out here, often carried more judgment than words. By September, Samuel's cabin was framed. By October, the roof was on. His woodpile barely reached his waist. That fact alone became a topic of conversation at the Lovell trading post, where men gathered in the evenings to talk through the coming winter, whether they admitted it or not. One night, a cattleman named Edgar Mallory, a man who had survived 2 hard winters already, said what everyone was thinking. That wheel won't keep him alive come February. Nobody contradicted him. And I'll tell you something honest. If I'd been there back then, younger and louder than I am now, I might have nodded along. Because winter on the high frontier doesn't respect intention. It respects what works when the wind is howling and the fire is losing ground inch by inch. At least, that's what we believed. Part 2. The kind of man who doesn't hurry the mistake they made was thinking Samuel Crowell was trying to avoid work. Men like Samuel are easy to underestimate while the weather is kind. He didn't talk much. He didn't explain himself. He didn't feel the need to perform effort for the approval of other men. On the frontier, that alone was enough to earn suspicion. Samuel had come west from the limestone hills of central Pennsylvania, a place where water shaped the land more than wind ever did. As a boy, he learned that root cellars stayed cool in summer and strangely warm in winter, no matter how violently the air above them changed. He learned that springs ran at the same temperature year after year, steady as a heartbeat. Those lessons don't look impressive in summer, but they change everything in January. While other settlers watched the sky and cursed the cold, Samuel paid attention to what didn't change. Clear Fork Creek never froze. Even when ice locked up still water nearby, that spring-fed flow stayed open, slipping out of the shale hillside at a steady 50 degrees, as if winter simply didn't apply to it. Most men saw water as something to cross, drink, or fear when it flooded. Samuel saw stored effort, work already being done, warmth already held by the earth waiting to be moved. That idea unsettled people. On the frontier, suffering had become a measure of virtue. Swinging an axe until your hands bled was proof you belonged. A man who trusted the land to do part of the work threatened that belief, whether he meant to or not. So Samuel built the wheel first, not fast, not large, just strong enough to turn forever. Gravity did the work. Water did the work. He simply arranged the path and stepped out of the way. People called it laziness. What it really was patience backed by years of watching how the land behaved when no one was looking. I've learned something since then, living close to the earth myself. Winter never defeats patience. It only defeats men who confuse effort with understanding. Part 3. The winter that broke good men. Winter came early to the Bighorn Basin in 1893, and it came hard enough to strip confidence before it ever touched flesh. By mid-November, the wind cut through wool coats like they weren't there. By December, it found every lie men told themselves about their cabins. Chinking cracked, corners froze solid, fires burned red hot and still lost ground. Floors stayed bitter cold, no matter how much wood vanished into iron stoves. Children woke crying because their feet hurt from the cold. Women slept lightly, listening for the sound of a fire dying in the dark hours before dawn. Men learned the sound frost makes when it forms inside your own walls. Woodpiles shrank faster than planned. That's when fear truly begins on the frontier. Not when snow falls, but when you realize your preparation isn't keeping pace with reality. Through it all, Samuel Crowell's chimney stayed dark. No smoke, no ash, no frantic dawn fires. Some men assumed he was already dead. Others whispered that he must be burning furniture or hiding some trick stove he hadn't shown. Pride kept most of them from asking, because asking meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, their own way wasn't enough. And that thought is colder than any wind. By late December, temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and refused to climb. The wind scoured the basin, slipping through cracks no one had noticed in summer. Firewood vanished at an alarming rate. Cabins grew dangerously cold at the edges, even while stoves glowed red at their centers. Winter was teaching its oldest lesson. Strength alone does not win. Beneath Samuel's quiet cabin, under planks that never froze solid, something steady was happening. Water moved where fire could not. Stone absorbed what flame could not hold. Heat flowed slowly, patiently, without asking anyone to wake up and feed it. And when the first true blizzard of January gathered itself in the north, the laughter that had followed Samuel all summer finally stopped traveling outward and began walking, step by frozen step, toward his door. Part 4, The Wheel That Did Nothing. By the time the first snow stayed on the ground, the wheel had become a kind of joke in the valley. Men rode past it, the way you pass a broken fence post. Something odd, something unfinished, something that didn't quite belong. It turned too slowly to impress anyone. 3 revolutions a minute on a good day. No roar, no spray, no visible effort. In a land where strength was measured by noise and speed, that quiet motion felt suspicious. What most men didn't understand was this: machines that shout usually fail first. Machines that whisper tend to last. Samuel Crowell's wheel didn't try to conquer the creek. It accepted what the creek was willing to give. The flume lifted water just high enough to let gravity do the rest. No gears screaming under strain, no belts snapping in the cold. Just weight, drop, and patience. A blacksmith named Jonah Reed came by one afternoon and watched the wheel for a long while without speaking. He finally said what others hadn't bothered to ask. "What's it turning?" Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers and nodded toward the cabin uphill. "Warmth," he said. Jonah laughed once, sharp and short. "Water don't burn." Samuel didn't argue. Men who live close to the land learn quickly that explanations given too early are wasted. Proof always arrives on its own schedule. What the wheel did wasn't obvious because it didn't create anything new. It didn't make heat. It didn't make power. It only moved what already existed. That idea runs against the grain of how most people think. We're taught to believe that warmth must be made violently, by fire, by fuel, by something being consumed. But the land works differently. It stores. It evens out. It releases slowly. The wheel's only job was to keep water moving, and as long as it moved, something beneath that cabin never stopped working, even while men slept. That's the part nobody noticed yet. Part 5. What water remembers. Here's something the frontier teaches if you survive long enough. The air lies. It changes its mind every hour. One moment it's calm, the next it's cutting through bone. Men plan their lives around it anyway, and winter takes advantage of that mistake every year. The ground is different. The ground remembers. Samuel learned that early, long before he ever built a wheel. He'd seen root cellars keep potatoes from freezing, while cabins above them turned into iceboxes. He'd watched spring water run steady and unfazed, while ponds locked solid under inches of ice. Water that comes from deep enough carries the temperature of the earth itself. It doesn't care what the wind is doing. In the Bighorn Basin, that meant water hovering right around 50 degrees, winter or summer. Now here's the part most folks struggle with. 50 degrees sounds cold until the air drops to 20 below zero. When that happens, that same water is suddenly 70 degrees warmer than everything trying to kill you. Warmth doesn't disappear, it moves. Samuel didn't need hot water. He needed warmer than the air water, moving constantly. As long as it flowed, it carried heat out of the ground and into the one place he needed it most, beneath his feet. This is where most men would have overbuilt. Bigger pumps, faster flow, more force. Samuel did the opposite. He kept the flow slow enough that the water had time to give up its warmth and steady enough that it never stopped. 3 gallons a minute doesn't look like much, but over a day, that's thousands of gallons passing quietly under a floor, each one surrendering a little warmth to stone that never forgets how to hold it. Fire flares and dies. Part 6, the floor that never sleeps. Most frontier cabins were built the same way. Joists over open air, planks nailed down. Whatever warmth your fire produced had to fight cold rising straight up from the ground. Men accepted frozen floors as part of life, the way they accepted sore backs and cracked hands. Samuel refused that bargain. Before he laid his floor, he dug deeper than necessary, creating a crawl space most folks would have called wasted effort. Into that space, he laid hollowed logs in a long, winding pattern, sealed tight with pitch and clay. The channels ran back and forth beneath the entire cabin, close enough that no spot above them was ever far from moving water. Above that, he packed river gravel, then flat stone, then thick pine planks fitted tight enough to keep drafts out. Stone doesn't heat quickly. That's why men dismissed it. But stone doesn't cool quickly either. Once it's warm, it stays warm. As water flowed through those channels, the stone absorbed the heat slowly and evenly. No spikes, no drops, just a steady release upward, hour after hour, night after night. That's the part most men couldn't imagine. A system that didn't care whether you were awake. A floor that worked while you slept. No midnight fire tending. No panicked dawn rebuilds. The first man to feel it was Caleb Morrison, a neighbor who came by one morning out of nothing but curiosity. He stepped inside, stamped his boots, and stopped. He bent down and pressed his palm to the floor. "Feels like sunlight," he said. "Not hot, not burning, just there." That kind of warmth does something fire never does. It rises gently through the body. It warms feet first, then legs, then chest. It doesn't shock frozen skin. It doesn't steal moisture from the air. It doesn't leave corners cold while the center cooks. Samuel still had a stove. He used it for cooking. Sometimes he fed it a little wood on the coldest nights. But the floor did the real work. And while other men woke exhausted from fighting fires that never quite won, Samuel slept through the worst hours of the night, with the land quietly doing its part beneath him. The valley didn't understand it yet. But the wind was building. January was coming. And soon the frontier would learn the difference between heat that demands attention and warmth that never asks. Part 7, the night fire lost. The blizzard announced itself before it arrived. Men who had lived on the plains long enough felt it first in their bones. Old injuries ached. Horses grew restless in their pens. Dogs refused to stray far from shelter. By the afternoon of January 11, 1894, the pressure dropped fast enough to make breathing feel wrong. By sundown, the wind came hard out of the northwest, driving snow sideways across the Bighorn Basin like thrown gravel. Temperatures fell through zero and kept falling. By midnight, it was 30 below, with worse coming. This wasn't ordinary cold. This was killing weather. The kind that didn't test comfort, it tested survival. Inside most cabins, fires were already losing ground. Men fed stoves until the iron glowed red, but the wind pulled heat out faster than flame could replace it. Gaps in chinking that went unnoticed all summer became channels for cold air, turning homes into bellows that pumped warmth straight into the storm. In Edgar Mallory's cabin, the fire never rested. He and his eldest son took turns through the night, hauling armloads of wood from a shrinking pile stacked against the windward wall. Every time the door opened, the cold slammed inside hard enough to steal breath. Frost crept across the walls faster than they could scrape it away. By midnight, Mallory's wife moved through the cabin with her coat still on, hands red and cracked, preparing food on a stove so hot it scorched anything left on it for more than seconds. Yet the corners of the room never rose above freezing. The floor felt like iron. Their youngest boy stopped crying sometime after midnight, his small body curled tight against his mother. That silence scared her more than the noise ever had. Downstream, Caleb Morrison woke to find ice coating the inside of his windows. His fire had burned low sometime before dawn, and the cold rushed in all at once. He rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, breath fogging thick in the air, knowing he was already behind. This was the night fire lost. No matter how hard men worked, no matter how much wood they burned, the wind was stronger. It pulled warmth out of cabins as fast as it was made, leaving families exhausted, afraid, and running out of options. And while the valley fought a losing battle with flame, Samuel Crowell's cabin sat quiet. No roar of fire, no glow of iron, no smoke clawing upward into the storm. The wheel kept turning. The water kept flowing. Beneath Samuel's floor, the stone mass he'd warmed slowly over weeks began giving back everything it had stored. The warmth didn't rush, it didn't spike. It didn't care about the wind screaming above it. It rose steadily, silently, through the planks. Warming feet first, then legs, then lungs. Inside, Samuel recorded the temperature by lamplight. Outside, 38 below zero. Floor surface, 56 degrees. Air at chest height, 51. No supplemental fire since morning. He closed his journal and blew out the lamp. Just after dawn, Edgar Mallory made his decision. His youngest child was breathing shallow now, lips tinged grey. The fire had consumed nearly 2 days' worth of wood in a single night, and the storm showed no sign of breaking. Mallory understood the arithmetic of survival well enough to know when it had turned against him. He wrapped his family in every blanket they owned, lashed what little firewood remained onto a sled, and stepped into the storm. The wind tore at his coat and burned his lungs with every breath. Snow erased the trail within minutes. Twice he nearly lost his footing and went down hard, dragging the sled sideways through drifts that reached his waist. What guided him wasn't sight, it was sound. Through the roar of the wind, he could hear the slow creak of Samuel Crowell's wheel, steady and alive, refusing to stop even as the storm tried to tear the valley apart. By the time Mallory reached Samuel's door, his beard was frozen solid against his scarf. Ice crusted his eyebrows. His children had stopped shivering, a sign any frontier man recognizes with dread. Samuel opened the door to a wall of cold and a family on the edge of death. He asked no questions. He moved fast but not panicked. He knew panic wastes heat. Within minutes, Mallory's children were laid on the warmest section of floor, boots removed so the radiant warmth could reach them directly. The heat came up slow and gentle, not the searing shock of fire that turns numb flesh into agony. Mallory's wife began to cry when feeling returned to her hands without pain. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the floor held steady. Before nightfall, Caleb Morrison arrived carrying his infant daughter against his chest. Her color had gone pale and her breathing came in shallow gasps. Samuel gave them the southeast corner, where the water passed longest beneath the floor. Within an hour, the child began to cry. Thin at first, then stronger. That sound cut through the cabin like sunrise. 8 people crowded into a space built for 4. The system didn't care. The wheel pumped the same steady flow. The stone released the same quiet warmth. Samuel used his cooking stove more often now, preparing food for the families sheltering with him, and the extra heat pushed the air temperature up a few more degrees. Outside, the blizzard raged for 3 days. Inside, no one froze. That night rewrote the valley's understanding of survival. Men who had measured safety in cords of firewood learned the hard way that strength alone cannot outfight the wind. Systems that demand constant attention fail first. Systems that work while you sleep endure. By the time the storm broke, the laughter that once followed Samuel Crowell had vanished completely. In its place was something heavier, respect, and the quiet knowledge that the land itself had chosen a side. Part 8, when mockery turned into footsteps, when the blizzard finally broke, it didn't do so gently. It left behind a valley stripped of illusion. Snow lay packed hard as stone, drifted shoulder-high against cabins that had barely held together. Fences vanished, trails were erased, The wind fell quiet in the way it does after exhausting itself, as if even the storm needed rest after what it had done. Men stepped outside to count losses. They counted frozen livestock first, then empty woodpiles, then the dark windows of cabins where no one came out at all. On the frontier, survival isn't measured by how hard you worked before winter. It's measured by who's still standing when winter lets go. Word traveled quickly, because it always does after danger passes. Samuel Crowell's cabin had stayed warm, not barely livable. Warm. The children who had arrived grey-lipped and silent walked back out days later on their own feet. The women who had come in shaking left with colour in their faces, and the men who had sworn no wheel could replace honest firewood carried something heavier home with them than gratitude. They carried doubt. That doubt showed itself in small ways at first. Men began riding past Samuel's place more slowly. They stopped longer at the creek. They watched the wheel turn, not with humour now, but with calculation. Some dismounted and stood quietly, boots planted in the snow, listening to the steady creak of oak and water. Nobody laughed anymore. The first to speak openly was Edgar Mallory. A week after the storm, he walked back to Samuel's cabin alone, carrying nothing but a notebook and the look of a man who knows he's been wrong. "I want to understand it," he said. "Not how did you trick winter, but how did you work with it?" That difference mattered. Samuel didn't boast. He didn't claim invention. He simply walked Mallory through the system from beginning to end. From the spring-fed creek to the flume. From the wheel to the pump. From the header tank down through the channels beneath the floor and back out to the stream again. "This isn't heat," Samuel said, tapping the floor with his boot. "It's movement." He explained how constant temperature mattered more than intensity. How water that never stopped flowing could give up warmth slowly without exhausting itself. How stone, once warmed, refused to give that warmth back to the wind all at once. Mallory listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, he asked the only question that mattered. Could a man build this after the cabin's already standing? Samuel nodded. With work, and with the right land. That second part spread slower. Not every claim had a spring. Not every creek ran steady through winter. Some men would never be able to copy what Samuel had done, no matter how badly they wanted to. The frontier teaches humility that way. The land decides what's possible long before men argue about it. But many claims did have what Samuel used, and those men began to see their land differently. Caleb Morrison tore up half his floor before spring. He laid a single channel beneath the coldest side of his cabin and packed stone over it. That winter, he burned less than half the wood he had the year before. Others built smaller wheels, slower pumps, shorter loops. Even partial systems changed everything. Floors warmed. Fires became backup instead of lifelines. Families slept through the night for the first time in years. The change wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with fewer coughs, with children playing on floors instead of clinging to stoves, with mornings that didn't begin in panic, and with a strange, uncomfortable realization settling over the valley. The man they had called lazy hadn't avoided work at all. He had avoided waste. On the frontier, that's a dangerous thing to admit, because it forces you to reconsider everything you've suffered through without question. Every blister, every midnight fire, every belief about what it means to earn warmth. Some men resisted that realization. They said Samuel had simply been lucky, that the storm was unusual, that next winter would be different, but winter doesn't care what you believe. By the time the snow melted enough to expose the ground, plans were already forming. Men measured slopes. They tested spring flow. They talked less about chopping and more about placement. The sound of axes returned to the valley, but it was different now, more deliberate, less frantic. Mockery had turned into footsteps. Footsteps toward a creek, toward a wheel that never rushed, toward an idea that had survived the one thing meant to kill it. And standing at the edge of it all was Samuel Crowell, watching quietly, knowing something the rest of the valley was only beginning to learn. True frontier strength isn't measured by how much pain you endure. It's measured by how well you listen. Before winter forces you to learn the hard way. Part 9. What the land taught me later. I didn't meet Samuel Crowell. By the time I was old enough to work land of my own, his wheel was already just another story passed around by men who spoke slower when winter came up in conversation. But the lesson he left behind found me anyway. The land has a way of doing that. Years later, when I built my own place far from town, I thought I understood cold. I'd cut wood my whole life. I knew the smell of sap in August and the ache that settles into your shoulders by October. I believed, the same way those men in the Bighorn Basin once believed, that survival came down to effort. More wood, bigger fire, longer nights awake. That belief lasted until the winter that finally taught me the difference between heat and warmth. The cold didn't come all at once. It crept in. It found the floor first. It always does. You can have a stove glowing red and still feel winter climbing into your bones through your feet. That's when I remembered the story of the wheel, not the machinery, the thinking behind it. Samuel hadn't tried to overpower winter, he'd sidestepped it. That's when I began looking at my own land differently. I stopped asking how much heat I could make and started asking where heat already lingered. I noticed that the soil a few feet down never froze the way the air did. I noticed that stone walls held warmth long after the fire went out. I noticed that places shielded from wind mattered more than places close to flame. Those observations didn't require a creak or a wheel. They required patience. Here's the lesson most folks miss when they hear stories like Samuel's. You don't need to copy the solution. You need to copy the reasoning. The frontier never rewards imitation for long. It rewards understanding. If you live in a modern house, the principle is the same. Floors matter more than ceilings. Drafts matter more than stove size. Thermal mass beats bursts of heat every time. A space that stays steady will always outperform one that swings wildly, no matter how impressive the equipment looks. That's as true now as it was in 1894. I've seen people pour money into bigger heaters while ignoring the cold crawling in, under doors and through walls. I've seen cabins made miserable by wind because no one thought to slow it down. Fire becomes a crutch when it's asked to do what structure should have handled quietly. Samuel understood that. So did the land. There's another lesson there too, one that doesn't get talked about much anymore. Systems that work while you sleep are worth more than systems that demand constant attention. Winter doesn't care if you're tired. It doesn't care if you're sick. It doesn't care if you miss one feeding of the fire at 3 a.m. The wheel never missed a shift. The water never overslept. The stone never forgot what it was holding. That kind of reliability changes how people live. It gives back time. It gives back rest. And on the frontier, rest wasn't luxury. It was survival. When I hear people today talk about resilience, I think about that floor, about warmth rising quietly from below instead of roaring from a stove that could fail at any moment. I think about the men who nearly froze with stacks of firewood behind their cabins, and the one man who stayed warm by listening instead of swinging harder. That's the part of the story worth carrying forward. Not the wheel, not the creak, but the habit of asking the land what it's already willing to give, before exhausting yourself trying to force an answer. And once you learn that habit, you never really unlearn it. You carry it into every winter, into every shelter you build, into every decision where effort and wisdom quietly compete for your trust. The frontier didn't disappear when the maps filled in. It just moved closer to home. And the same rules still apply, whether you're heating a cabin, building a house, or trying to make a life that doesn't break you every time the weather turns hard. Samuel Crowell learned that lesson early. The rest of us, we usually learn it the winter we finally have to. Part 10. Why Hard Work Failed. There's a belief that runs deep in places shaped by cold and distance. The belief that suffering proves worth. That the man who works the hardest must be the man who deserves to survive. On the frontier, that belief kept people moving when fear tried to stop them. It pushed men to split wood until their hands bled and haul water until their backs bowed. For a long time, it worked well enough to become tradition. But winter never promised fairness. The storm that nearly broke the Bighorn Basin didn't care who worked hardest the summer before. It didn't count calluses. It didn't measure sweat. It didn't spare families because they followed the rules faithfully. It simply exposed a hard truth most men didn't want to face. Hard work alone is not a strategy. Edgar Mallory had worked harder than anyone. His woodpile was taller than most. His stove burned hotter than all. And still, when the wind rose and the cold dug in, that effort collapsed under its own weight. Fire demanded constant attention, and winter punished every moment it didn't get it. That's where the frontier's thinking went wrong. Men treated effort as proof of wisdom, when wisdom was supposed to decide where effort belonged. Swinging an axe felt virtuous because it was visible. It made noise, it hurt, but none of that mattered to the wind. Samuel Crowell didn't work less. He worked earlier, and he worked differently. He put his labor where winter couldn't reach it. He spent effort on structure instead of reaction. He invested in steadiness rather than intensity. When the storm arrived, his work was already finished, and it kept working without him. That's the difference winter recognizes. There's a reason the cold always attacks the weakest point first. It slips through cracks. It climbs up through flaws. It waits until you're tired and then asks for one more effort than you can give. Systems that rely on constant strength eventually fail because strength runs out. Systems built around balance do not. That lesson isn't comfortable. It forces people to admit that some of their suffering was unnecessary. That some of the hardship they took pride in wasn't proof of character, but proof of habit. That's why Samuel was mocked. Not because he was wrong, but because he threatened an identity built around endurance for its own sake. The frontier has always punished pride disguised as toughness. It just does it quietly, after the applause fades. When I look back now, I don't see a valley full of weak men. I see strong men trapped inside an idea that no longer served them. An idea that said working harder was always better than working smarter. Winter broke that idea, and once it broke, it couldn't be repaired. Because every man who walked out of Samuel's cabin, warm and alive, carried that knowledge with him. Knowledge doesn't burn, it doesn't freeze, and once learned the hard way, it doesn't go away. That's why the frontier doesn't change quickly, but when it does, it changes completely. Hard work didn't fail because it lacked virtue. It failed because it was pointed in the wrong direction. And the land, patient as it always is, waited for men to learn the difference. Part 11, How the Idea Spread and Why It Didn't Work Everywhere. Ideas don't travel fast on the frontier. They move the way people move after winter, carefully, carrying only what they trust enough to keep alive. No one rushed to copy Samuel Crowell's system the moment the storm broke. Men don't rebuild their beliefs that quickly. They test them first, quietly, in small ways. The first changes were almost invisible. A man would pack stone under one corner of his floor instead of leaving it open to the wind. Another would dig a shallow trench beneath his coldest wall and run creek water through it just to see what happened. Some built small wheels that barely turned, not to heat an entire cabin, but to warm a single room where children slept. Those experiments mattered more than success stories, because on the frontier, nothing earns trust faster than failure. You survive. Caleb Morrison's first attempt flooded his crawl space and froze solid when he misjudged the slope. Another settler cracked his floor planks by running water too fast, through channels that couldn't release heat evenly. A third man discovered too late that his creek didn't flow year-round, leaving him with a system that worked beautifully in December and betrayed him in February. Those failures traveled just as fast as Samuel's success. And that's what made the idea stronger. Men learned that this wasn't a trick. It wasn't magic. It wasn't something you could force onto land that didn't want it. The system demanded humility. It only worked where the ground offered constant water, steady temperature, and enough fall to keep things moving without strain. Some claims had that. Many did not. The frontier has never rewarded copying without understanding. Men whose land couldn't support the full system still learned something valuable. They stopped relying on fire as their first line of defense. They treated it as backup instead of lifeline. They learned to block wind before feeding flame. They learned that where heat is placed matters more than how much is made. Even partial understanding changed lives. Cabins stayed warmer with less fuel. Nights grew quieter. Families slept longer. Coughs faded. Children stopped clustering around stoves like moths around danger. By the winter of 1895, 5 cabins in the basin were running some version of Samuel's approach. None were identical. All were better than before. Wood consumption dropped so sharply it frightened men who had spent their lives measuring safety in stacked logs. But the idea didn't spread everywhere. Men from neighboring valleys came to see it for themselves. Some went home inspired. Others left shaking their heads. Their land didn't offer what Samuel's did. Their water ran shallow or stopped altogether. Their ground didn't hold warmth the same way. That limitation mattered. Because the most dangerous stories on the frontier are the ones that pretend land doesn't matter. Samuel never made that mistake. He never claimed his way was universal. He said it plainly to anyone who asked. This only works where the ground agrees. That honesty kept the idea alive longer than exaggeration ever could. A traveling newspaperman passed through in the summer of 1896, drawn by rumors of a cabin warmed without firewood. He wrote a careful piece, more skeptical than impressed, noting the failures as much as the successes. He described the wheel, the channels, the stone floors, and the limits imposed by geography. That article mattered. It framed the system not as a miracle, but as an example of frontier thinking done right. Observation first, effort second, respect always. Some readers tried to copy it and failed. Others adapted pieces of it and succeeded. That's how real knowledge spreads, slowly, unevenly, with scars. And somewhere in that process, something else changed. Men stopped asking, "How hard did he work?" and started asking, "Why did that work here?" That question alone marked the end of an era, because once you start asking why, the frontier stops being an enemy to defeat and starts becoming a partner you have to understand. Samuel Crowell never left the basin. He didn't patent anything. He didn't sell plans. He answered questions when asked and returned to his quiet routines when he wasn't. The wheel turned, the water flowed. The system did what it was built to do without asking for recognition. And that, more than anything else, is why the idea survived. It didn't demand belief. It didn't promise miracles. It simply worked. Where it could, and where it couldn't, it taught men something just as valuable, that the land sets the rules, and survival begins the moment you stop arguing with them. Part 12. The part most people still get wrong. Here's the part most people still miss, even after hearing the whole story. They think the secret was the wheel, or the creek, or the stone floor. It wasn't. Those were just tools, and tools don't save anyone by themselves. Tools only do what they're told, and most people are asking the wrong questions before they ever pick one up. The real difference wasn't what Samuel Crowell built. It was what he refused to fight. Most men on the frontier believed winter was an enemy, something to overpower with more wood, bigger fires, longer nights awake. Every year became a contest of endurance, and whoever suffered the most was praised as strong. Samuel didn't try to defeat winter, he stepped around it. That distinction matters more than any piece of equipment ever could. Winter didn't kill people because it was strong. It killed people because it was constant. It never slept. It never tired. And systems that depended on human strength eventually failed because humans do. Samuel understood something uncomfortable. If you build a life that only works when you're awake, healthy, and alert, then your life is fragile. The moment you get sick, tired, or distracted, it starts to fall apart. The wheel never asked Samuel how he felt that morning. The water never cared if he was exhausted. The floor never needed encouragement to keep working. That's the kind of strength winter respects. And that lesson goes far beyond cabins and creeks. I've watched men ruin themselves by turning effort into identity. They work harder every year, not because it's necessary, but because they don't know how to stop. They burn energy the way frontier men burned firewood, faster than they realize, convinced they can always cut more later. But winter always comes earlier than expected. Sometimes it shows up as age, sometimes as illness, sometimes as a bad year you didn't plan for. And when it does, systems built on constant effort collapse all at once. That's why Samuel's way still matters. Not because you can all build water wheels, but because you can all ask the same question he did. What around me is already steady? Most people never ask that. They ask how to push harder instead. Samuel looked for what didn't change when everything else did. He looked for temperature that didn't care about seasons, for movement that didn't require supervision, for structure that kept working even when no one was watching. That mindset is portable. You can apply it to how you heat a home, to how you earn a living, to how you pace your own body. Anything that requires constant emergency effort is a warning sign. Anything that collapses the moment you stop feeding it is already failing. It just hasn't reached winter yet. The frontier taught that lesson the hard way, because the stakes were life and death. Modern life teaches it quietly, through exhaustion, stress, and the slow erosion of people who confuse busyness with resilience. Samuel Crowell wasn't lazy, he was selective. He spent his effort where it would last the longest. He refused to waste strength fighting something that could be redirected instead. He trusted the land to do what it had always done, hold steady, and built his life around that truth. That's the part most people still get wrong. They chase intensity when stability would serve them better. They chase noise when quiet systems are doing the real work. They chase proof of effort instead of proof of function. The wheel turned slowly, the water moved patiently. The floor stayed warm while men slept. And that wasn't an accident. It was the result of a man who understood that real resilience doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roar or glow red in the dark. It just keeps working when everything else gives up. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start looking at your own life differently. You start asking harder questions. And you stop being impressed by systems that only work when you're burning yourself to keep them alive. Samuel learned that lesson on the frontier. Most people today learn it much later, if they learn it at all. But the land hasn't changed, and neither has the truth it's always offered to anyone patient enough to listen. Part 13. The wheel still turns years past. The Bighorn Basin filled in the way all frontiers do. New cabins rose, old ones sagged and disappeared, trails widened into roads. The trading post gained a proper front door. Men who once measured winter in cords of wood began measuring it in deliveries and schedules instead. But the wheel kept turning. Samuel Crowell rebuilt it twice over the years. Oak paddles wore smooth from constant motion. Pins loosened and were replaced. The creek shifted its course slightly after a spring flood, and Samuel adjusted the flume without complaint. He never tried to make the wheel permanent, he only made it dependable. The floor beneath his cabin never changed. Stone doesn't care about decades. Gravel doesn't forget what it holds. Water moved beneath those planks the same way it always had, quietly giving up warmth it never claimed as its own. Winters came and went. Some were mild, some were brutal. The system worked through all of them. When Samuel died, they buried him on a rise overlooking the creek. There was no monument, just a marker and a view of the water he had trusted more than fire. The men who once laughed at him told the story to their sons differently than they had lived it. They no longer talked about laziness. They talked about patience. They talked about paying attention before swinging an axe. They talked about the winter when fire failed and something quieter held. And then, slowly, even those stories faded. That's the way of things. People remember effort longer than understanding. They remember how hard something was, not why it worked. But the land remembers differently. The creek still runs where it always has. The ground still holds its temperature. And systems that work without being fed still outperform those that demand constant sacrifice. I stand on my own porch now, older than Samuel ever was when he built that wheel, and I see the same mistakes being made under different names. Bigger heaters, faster fixes, louder solutions that demand attention every hour of the day. And I hear the same quiet exhaustion underneath it all. People are burning themselves the way frontier men burned firewood. Faster than they realize, convinced they'll find more time, more strength, more energy later. But winter still comes. Sometimes it comes as age, sometimes as illness, sometimes as a year that simply doesn't go the way you planned. And when it does, the only things that hold are the ones that were built to keep working without you standing over them. That's the real inheritance Samuel Crowell left behind. Not a wheel, not a flaw, not a clever trick from a harsher time. He left behind a way of seeing, a way of asking the land and life a better question before paying the price for the wrong one. What here is already steady? What here doesn't panic when conditions change? What here will keep working when I can't? Those questions still matter, more now than ever. The frontier didn't disappear, it just moved inward, into our homes, into our bodies, into the systems we build and exhaust ourselves maintaining. The wheel turned because it didn't fight the creek. The cabin stayed warm because it didn't challenge the ground. And Samuel lived well because he understood that real strength doesn't come from constant struggle. It comes from alignment. The wheel kept turning, the water kept flowing, and warmth rose quietly through a floor built by a man who understood something the rest of us are still learning. The land never